Good afternoon, everybody who's on the call. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to log in. So get comfortable. Make sure you've got a coffee or a tea. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. We've got a few introductions to do first, so it'll give people time to log into the event. So welcome to the Delivering Value Add Fleet Insurance with regards to safety event. I'll just give you a quick handle on some of the rules of engagement, or how I like to say. Excuse me. So, we're going to cover off some housekeeping first. So obviously this event is going to be recorded. So we can send the recording to you straight after the session. So if you've missed anything, or for people who might tune in a little bit later, if you want to share it with colleagues, then you'll be able to do that. If you've any questions, please post them as you go along. So we're going to monitor the chat box. By all means, wait till the end. We have got a Q&A session at the end, but sometimes things are better handled actually at the time. So we'll have a look at that as we go through, and we'll bring any questions in if we feel it's the right time to do so. So I'm delighted to have with me today Adrian Hyde. Adrian is a fleet risk expert. So he's a driver risk management specialist. Like myself, he's got I nearly said checkered background then, Adrian. That's not what I meant. I meant a varied and extensive risk background. So Adrian's worked in operations, working for Staffordshire Council, and he's also worked for TTC Group, all in the area of driver risk management. And he now has his own driver risk management consultant company. My name's Alison Moriarty. For those of you who don't know me, I was the driver risk manager for Skanska. So I looked after Skanska Fleet in terms of risk. Before that, I was at Arriva and M Group. Started my time, it was Lancashire County Council and then Enterprise. So very similar to Adrian in that I've got a public and private sector background. During all of those roles, was very involved with our fleet insurance. So took a couple of our fleets from blended insurance to actually special fleet separate insurance, which was something that wasn't very attractive at the time because I don't think our collision rates and things were particularly brilliant. So after we made some improvements, that was kind of my background in the insurance part of it. So Adrian, when we talk about encouraging drivers, I think there's always the initial feeling, obviously driving safely is part of somebody's role if they're a driver. And I think we probably all believe that to be the case. Where do you stand on rewarding drivers specifically for driving safely?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, Alison, because in my experience, that there are two things I think that we bear in mind here. One is that a lot of drivers will probably take for granted their driving activity, and when we introduce something that is going to require them to do something a bit different or a little bit new, they might go kicking and screaming and very often say, well, what's in it for me?
Yeah.
And if we can sort of communicate the benefits to that individual of, keeping you safe at work means that, we keep you safe per se, don't we? But if it is that there is going to be something that you can aspire to, whether it's financial rewards or it's time off or it's on a league table, I think sometimes people's natural competitiveness comes out. So
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting topic. There are some businesses that will say, why on earth should I reward drivers for doing what we expect them to do? And there are others that will be saying that, yeah, we'll be introducing some new rules and processes. We would like to reward those that help us along that journey. So I think it's interesting from both the employer and the employee perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And I think as well, that almost sort of gamification part of
Yeah.
drivers get very competitive with each other, don't they? And particularly if you're using some sort of league table, people always want to get to the top of that. And I think maybe when we think about rewarding drivers, it doesn't always have to be financial, does it? It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be
Yeah.
something major, just allowing people to, be driver of the month and have a badge and maybe get some vouchers. It may not be worth a lot, but that can really encourage people to put the effort in. And I think, driving for me is a life skill. So it's not just about that driver being safe when he's actually working. It's about them taking that back to the family and friends and into the community as well. And I think that can be something to push as well with drivers.
Definitely.
So we're looking at, there are obviously some, what I suppose people would say if they're cons, maybe something negative. But talking about myself, so when I've done this, when I was in an operational role, in terms of the cons, which I think it's quite right that we look at the negatives as well. And unless you've got a really fair, robust system, that can be a con, because if people don't feel that they're being treated fairly or treated the same as everybody else. So I think my biggest mistake was doing a most improved driver, and then it became apparent as we talked to people that people who have always been really good, careful drivers were never up for any awards. And yet actually they've been doing that the whole of the working life. So you've got to be really careful, I think, haven't you, how you put this in practice?
Yeah, you have, and I think you've got to make sure that you've got a level playing field as well, because it could be that some of the matrix that you use to reward the drivers or put them into the league table, or whatever it is you do, if you're using that, let's say for example, from telematics, but then there's a portion of the fleet that don't have that, then how are you going to make it fair to those individuals as well? Otherwise, someone will be thinking, well, there's absolutely no chance of me getting there, so why bother? So I think it's important that you look at, if you're going to have some form of reward scheme, it's got to be accessible to all in a level playing field.
Yeah. And Nicholas, you've obviously made the comment that Drive Commander want to link with a reward. And I don't think that necessarily having a reward's a bad thing, but I think it's the parity and making sure that it's absolutely fair across the board. It's got to have, it's got to be robust, and it's got to have some integrity. And I think if you do that, then there are ways of doing it. The stats that are there have been taken from articles, but I do question some of those percentages. The only way, unless there were two vehicles in the fleet, or unless that fleet was a very, very poor performing fleet, they seem quite big percentages, don't they, for improvement. So having a look at the insurer-led fleet risk insights, which is kind of what I guess most people on this call are interested in. My view of it, working quite closely with some of our insurers now, is that it's quite a crowded market. And I think whatever you can be seen as a value add to your customer is obviously going to put you at the forefront when people are looking for an insurer. And I think, as I said before, maybe because there's a lot more in terms of telematics and data and lots of different companies out there, now people are really looking for those differences, and they really want to use things to improve the risk. What are your views on how that can help the insurance industry, Adrian?
Well, I just sit thinking whilst you were talking about this, Alison, and I don't think that insurance companies should underestimate the influence that they have with the businesses that we work with,
Yeah,
because driver safety and driver risk management is not that topic that one day the controlling mind of the business is going to get up on a Monday morning and say, right, today's the day I'm going to sort out my driver safety, and head to Google and go searching. And very often the conversation I will have with the business will say, my insurer has told me I should do this.
yeah.
So I think there's a lot of value in insurers understanding what good driver risk management looks like, so that they can then recognize this in the customers that they're wanting to insure, and then be able to give them a little bit of feedback and say, right, yeah, we can quote you based on the way that your current fleet is, but have you thought about if?
Yeah,
And I'm pretty sure then underwriting is going to look more favorably on a well-managed fleet, aren't they?
they are. And I think I always talk about this difference between actual risk and perceived risk.
Yeah.
And I know in the insurance industry, most insurance policies in the past, it's been historical data, usually collision data, um, which is one indicator, obviously. However, it is a very lagging indicator in terms of what's happening there and then on the fleet. And I think being able to look at up to date, day to day data dynamically shows you what the actual risk of the fleet is. So it also, it allows you to reward companies who have started to put things in place and who have gone down a road of obviously being aware of the risk and trying to look at how they can improve it, rather than looking at, what were they like 3 years ago and not recognizing kind of where they were in the space now. And I think, when I was operational, one of the things we really struggled with was being able to benchmark ourselves against similar fleets. And I
Yeah.
think benchmarking is a really important thing to be able to do. And as an insurer, that's a real value add you can give to the businesses that you're working with, because being able to bring all that data together, and not requiring your clients to necessarily have new telematics put in, but just actually using the
Mm.
existing data that they have and being able to show them, albeit maybe anonymously in a table, but to be able to say, well, actually, for a similar fleet, you're kind of 3 out of 10 in terms of where your risk base is. Which is really, really useful, and also does give those people in the businesses that extra little push again to be able to go to the board and say, we need to up our game because actually we're quite down the bottom of this list of people.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses, unfortunately, just accept the status quo, don't they? In that,
Yeah,
hey, we've got a fleet of vehicles, we've got drivers, stuff's going to happen. And I think if an insurer was able to say, do you know what, we have a portfolio of clients, and businesses similar to yours actually are far lower risk, have a better claims history because they have certain things in place that you don't. So it
yeah.
might just encourage them to to sort of look to introducing some good driver risk management programs into the business.
Yeah, and like I said, it's all about that value add, isn't it? It's
Mm.
about if your potential customers have several options, then why would they not go with a company who are actually recognizing where they were and what they were doing within their industry? And I think that's really important. So, I mean, we've obviously at Matrix been working with a number of partners, and particularly in the insurance space, and we've been able to show that it does improve driver scores, and it's something that really can be used as a base to start doing that all that sort of good work. So this is what I was talking about before about benchmarking. I think it's quite difficult it's quite difficult for fleet managers sometimes to even benchmark within their own business. I
Mm.
don't know about when you were operational, Adrian, but I know because there were large fleets that I worked in, I occasionally, because of legacy issues, had maybe 4 or 5 different telematics companies working in different vehicles, and to be able to actually look at those to see where that risk was spread across a business was really, really difficult. And that was just within one business.
Yeah, I think you've probably had some similar experiences to me, Alison, in that we're quite lucky and we understand this stuff.
Yeah,
So if you give me a dashboard, with some telematics data, I can look at it and I can pretty much work out and see where maybe the risks lie, and then be able to dig a little bit deeper to see, well, what is it I think we need to do to be able to address those risks. But I think we have to be very cognizant, and so does the insurance industry, that fleet managers, traditionally, their role is to acquire, manage, maintain, and dispose of vehicles.
Yeah.
They don't want to be dealing with the person that drives them. So as much as we tend to think the fleet manager is our go-to person, we're going to be adding to their day job. And they might not necessarily see this as their role. So I think we need to make sure that we really help them understand the data, and what it means in real terms. And there are going to be a lot of businesses, we mustn't forget, that don't have a fleet manager.
Absolutely.
It will be some poor soul who that particular day is going to be taking the hat off the peg that happens to be driver safety. So they're really out their comfort zone. So certainly the data is important, but the way we present it, and the insights that we give, and the recommended actions from that, we've really got to do some hand holding.
We have, and I think we used to always make the joke that the person who's in charge of the car fleet is usually the person who was on holiday when the meeting was held to decide who's in charge of the car fleet. You know, some poor person from HR would come back and find that they were suddenly in charge of it. And you know, I think as well, it's very completely legitimate to be able to advise your customers as insurers to where that expertise can be found, because there's nobody can do it all. And I think, you know, during lockdown, there was quite a lot of, if you looked on LinkedIn, it was so quite sadly lots and lots of people working in fleet who were being made redundant at that time, who I don't think have all been replaced. So I think there is a bit of a skills shortage around some fleets in terms of even looking at the data to, like you say, we've been looking at this data for all our working lives, but to actually look at it and then think, okay, so what's my strategy now? So I know where I am. I can see what level we are. I know we need to be better. How do I improve that? So I think, you know, there's a real legitimacy there to actually finding people to bring in to do that work, rather than trying to muddle through, because you can make very expensive mistakes if you're not careful with it. So we've got some cons here with benchmarking that not sure I 100% agree with, but I think it is a good starting point for the talk, because I do think we've been reliant on data. I'm not sure now moving forward in this day and age it is a bad thing, because I think we are all becoming more data led, and there's, you know, the old adage, if you can't measure it you can't improve it, which I 100% agree with. I'm sure you've used that in your time, Adrian, when you've been speaking to people. So I think it is really important that we can do that, and I think I do agree that benchmarking is only useful to a point. So it's useful if you are a like-minded fleet. So it depends on the diversity in your fleet. You know, if you're a predominantly van fleet and you're looking at a mixed fleet with lots of HGVs in, there of course are going to be anomalies there. But I still think in terms of benchmarking, it is very, very useful for a fleet to be able to get a bit of a reality check as much as anything to see where they are.
Yeah, and I think benchmarking will mean different things to different people, won't it? But I'm sure you're the same, Alison. I've worked with businesses where they have no idea the costs in running their fleet. They see the bills coming in for repairs and fuel and tires and what have you. But they haven't got a handle on what the hidden costs are, particularly around incidents. And very often that there's nobody capturing this data. So you know, when you're trying to put a case together to demonstrate an improvement, I think to have some baseline data to work forward from is very useful.
It is, yeah. And I think as well, if you can put it in terms of the specific business that you're working with. I had this conversation with an operations director who really wasn't on board, particularly with doing some of the things that I wanted to do with the fleet. And this is, you know, their business was going out on Lane Road. and if you could lay the road for X amount less but still do a good job, that was brilliant because your profit margin was higher. And it wasn't really until I went to him with so rather than looking at making that money, look, there's this huge pool of money here that we are wasting on crash damage, we're wasting because our insurance is high, and actually being able to put it into that tangent. And I did it in terms of how much road we had to lay every year before we were in profit, and that soon got the attention of them. So I think it's quite important to be able to put it in that. It's a good point you've made, Nicholas, on the chat as well. Being able to put these things in the forefront rather than spending the money, which you will do after there's been a collision, with either your insurance or actually, crash damage if you're self-insured. But it is much better to put that money in at the front end and stop these things happening, because we can't forget as well, we're talking insurance today and we're talking cost, but we are also talking lives, and that's really, really important. We've got a duty, and driving's a work activity. We have an absolute safety duty to look after these people. It's strange that, isn't it? It's quite often forgotten as a work activity, Adrian. People don't see it in the same light.
It is. It's very interesting actually, because when you look at the legislation that underpins why a business should manage driver safety, and it falls back to the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Health and Safety at Work regulations, and then it talks about work equipment. The Health and Safety Executive will turn around and say a motor vehicle, when used for work, is a piece of work equipment.
Yeah.
Treat it in exactly the same way as you would a lathe or any other piece of work equipment. And that in itself brings up another interesting topic, because very often business people will say to me, yeah, but they've passed their driving test. They've got their piece of paper that says they're a qualified driver, haven't they? So, good luck with you and argue that one in court. So, so I think really it's a case of making sure that the business say, right, okay, if this is a piece of work equipment, I have a duty of care to my employees. I must make sure that they are competent to utilize this equipment. Therefore, we will explore the various appropriate training measures that we could probably put in place.
Absolutely, and the pure eggs absolutely is something that need to be looked at in terms of that. So when we're looking at automatic feedback, this is quite a controversial issue, because obviously we've both worked in the industry a long time, and we've both had our own telematics providers with the companies that we've worked with. And this seems to be, every time we have some sort of conference or a meeting, this seems to be one of the things that's comes up as being almost a 50-50 split sometimes, about whether instant feedback is A, useful, but B, distracting. What are your views around that?
Yeah, I'm a massive fan of technology. I'm lucky to drive an electric car that talks to me and that shows me all sorts of stuff that's going on. And some of these things are great and some are a distraction. I originally, when we first started looking at telematics, I was quite impressed by the instantaneous feedback.
Yeah.
But then I started to think a little bit. Sometimes a little light would flash at me, and I'd be thinking, "What's that done that for?" And I'm pretty sure, whilst I was sort of searching my memory banks as to what is it I think I did wrong, was I concentrating on the road ahead? So I think we've got enough stuff in the vehicles these days that distract us. My own personal view is that, okay, if a driver's made or triggered an activity, they can't go back and change it there and then. There's probably going to be more value in that driver being made aware of it at a later stage, that they can reflect on that in total rather than worry about the isolated incident. So I'm sort of one of those on the side of the 50% that says I'm not entirely sure we should be having instantaneous feedback in the vehicle.
I think one of the things as well that is a potential risk from having it, apart from the distraction of it actually being in cab, is that I think there is maybe then a sort of propensity for fleet managers or health and safety people to then not do like a proper feedback with drivers, because they think, oh, you get the feedback in the cab, you can look at the app afterwards. And I think the stats that are on there about, the fleet claims have seen to decrease, which is obviously a really good thing. And both you and I are fans of technology, and anything that can make people safer is definitely something I'm on board with. You know, there's lots of things
Yeah.
that we've got in vehicles now that do improve safety, but I think it's just being aware of there is another side to them. And I think, you know, the 56% of negative reviews coming from dissatisfied drivers, there will be a percentage, whatever telematics you use, of dissatisfied drivers because they don't really want to be held to book for their driving. But also, some of the drivers don't really realise that they're not driving very well. So
No.
having something flashing or beeping or whatever that instant feedback is, if that's your normal driving style, do you actually equate that with you having done something wrong? Whereas if you actually have a sit down afterwards with a manager explaining to you why that's dangerous, or, you know, bringing somebody like yourselves or you know, our company in to actually do that talk with drivers, definitely gives you a much broader perspective as a driver of what actually is it that I am doing wrong.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was thinking about, I was sat in traffic the other day and there'd been some collision and we were sort of moving forward at a snail's pace. And even though I was like literally moving at 2 miles an hour, my sensors were beeping constantly because of all the cars that were stopped around me on the motorway. And I was just thinking, God, if this was my job, if I was a driver as a professional, I can see that sometimes that might be more of an irritant than actually enabling me to improve driving, which is why so many people snip wires and put the coats over lights and all the things we know from reviews that people are doing. So I think that's one that it's interesting as insurers for you to be looking at and to be thinking about what systems are best if you're going to be recommending, or if you're taking a fleet on that has this sort of thing. Those conversations that you have with them, very open and honest conversations about, you know, do you feel that there's any possibility of this being a distraction and actually putting somebody at more risk, or, you know, there may be that the drivers feel that it's something that they really like. So no answers. It is very much an open question. I think that one, Adrian, isn't it, for
Yeah,
people
I
to?
think just to add to that, Alison, is also you know, when you're looking at systems also, um, you ideally want a system that is going to be looking for patterns as
Yeah,
opposed to individual triggers, because if you've got a device in the vehicle that flashes a light or makes a bleep every time you go over a speed limit, you could take a knee-jerk reaction to this and say, look, I've got a driver here who's on 31 occasions today he's been speeding.
yeah,
When you analyze that data, you think, do you know what, this driver has entered a speed limit slightly above, hence the trigger, but has very quickly got themselves back within the speed limit.
yeah,
We haven't got an issue with that driver. Whereas you might have another driver who's only got 2 speeding triggers, but they were 55 and a 30 on both occasions for a long period of time. So
yeah.
I think it's making sense of the data, looking for patterns rather than individual triggers, and making sure that the system is customizable so that we can get rid of some of the noise. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
otherwise the fleet manager is going to be absolutely overwhelmed. And what will they do? They'll turn it off.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about this in the past, haven't we? That data is absolutely fantastic, but too much data and
Yeah.
not knowing what to do with it's just overwhelming, and you can get to a point where you don't do anything because it's knowing where to make that start. So this is an interesting one. So forgetting the sort of individual driver rewards, which can be contentious. I think from an insurer's point of view, actually using rebates and rewards to incentivize fleets is a really, really good way of doing that. And I think that getting that safety message across, for me, it's all about safety. And I know you're the same. That's our absolutely primary focus on any sort of telematics and data usage. But there are people in businesses who are very monetary driven. And I think, you know, to be able to have that conversation about if you can lower the risk on the fleet, and actually if you can, you know, reduce your collisions and reduce your speeding events, actually we can reward you as a company for doing that. I think that's a very different thing. And I think it definitely is kind of a win-win situation there, isn't it, for the fleet and for the insurer?
Yeah, I think so. And it's always very heartening when I work with the business that say, we're going to invest in driver training because we've had a rebate from our insurers. So we're going to reinvest that money back into driver safety. So,
Yeah,
I think sometimes it, by creating that reward in the first instance, I think we're going to nudge the business into doing the right thing for the
yeah.
people, right thing for the business, and right thing for the insurers as well, because a lower risk. But what it might do is free up a little bit of money that they wouldn't otherwise have budgeted for to do other
Yeah,
good things within driver safety.
absolutely. And I think there is, there in the cons, it's something that does come up in conversation from drivers. Well, why do I care if my company's getting cheaper insurance or getting a rebate back? It doesn't make any difference to me. But I think there's a wider conversation there about the things we were talking about before, about it being a life skill and keeping communities safer, but also making the company more profitable. And a more profitable company is likely to take on more people and certainly not be laying people off. So I think there is a way of tying people in. But I think, as a company, if you want to do the kind of lower level type reward with drivers, things just like recognizing who's a good driver and who's been driving well. I think there's no harm in doing that so that they feel part of the process. And I think that's a really big one, is for drivers to feel part of that, definitely going forward. We've got an interesting one here, Adrian, and I hope we're going to be on the same page with that. So, Nicholas says, what to say to drivers who say it's an infringement of civil liberties, recording events, videoing within cab cameras, or restricting device use. My personal take on that is that they are driving a work vehicle. That work vehicle is on work insurance. They are conducting a work activity. You wouldn't allow them to do any other work activities dangerously. They'll be observed doing lots of other things. And actually, I have several times now been able to use in-cab footage to actually support and defend drivers when there's been an
Yeah.
incident. And I think that actually happens more often than people think, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I think one of the things is that safety overrules everything, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And at the end of the day, a business has a legal duty of care to their employees and anybody else their employees come into contact with as a result of that activity. The activity being driving,
yeah,
and particularly if if it's a company vehicle, it's a company asset. That business has every right to protect that asset.
yeah,
So they will look at a range of measures, won't they, to facilitate that? And some form of telematics or dash cams is going to be one of those pieces of the toolkit that they're going to use. I think it boils down, you need to wind the clocks back and look at this whole communication piece that we talked about. You don't
yeah,
just suddenly say to everybody, today we're going to be fitting telematics and recording everything, get on with it. It's a case of, right, okay, this is what we're thinking of doing. This is the reason why we're doing it. It's all about you, your safety. And if we can show some case studies where we've been able to evidence and support a driver that was completely
yeah.
in the right, then they've nothing to fear.
And also, I think if you're working with companies who are struggling with that as well, one of the things that I would really strongly advise is if they've got unions in the company, to bring them in at the earliest possible point to discuss with them. We've got great relationship with a lot of the unions that we deal with, because they can see that it's all about safety, and
Yeah,
that's, if you can show that, then there's not really an argument for not doing that, because why would you not want somebody to be safer on the road where all your other members are, where all your other members, loved ones, families, friends are, everybody, it's in their best interest for people to be driving more safely. So it is, it is something that comes up a lot, but I think from a kind of legal standpoint, it is the things that Adrian said. It's a company asset, it's company insurance and all that. But I think from a moral background as well, if you start to talk to drivers about, this is to improve your safety and, to make you aware of how you can cut your own risk, because it's as much about that driver going home safely at the end of the day than it is about sort of saving any money.
absolutely.
Right, we've got a couple of questions in. So, Lorna said, if the company could save money on their insurance in real time each month based on driver performance, would they share some of this saving with the drivers as an incentive? I mean, I think that's an absolute possibility, Lorna, to recognise that those drivers have put the time and effort in to start to lower the risk. What do you think about that, Adrian?
I think it goes back to that question, doesn't it, that we posed a little bit earlier on. So my company's going to save money on their insurance. So what?
Yeah.
But if there was a mechanism to pass on some of those savings as an incentive to the individual, then it's a win-win-win all round, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. And I think, um, companies will take different standpoints on this, obviously. But I think whatever works for your company, and it might be that different companies have different approaches. I think when you speak to companies, you'll get a feel for what they've done in the
Yeah.
past and what things have worked for them. And I think really things that work, that's what we want to do. I don't know if anybody's just seen I've got a note come up on my screen to say there's a problem to refresh the page, but I won't do because I think everything's going along smoothly. I think you can still hear me, Adrian, can you?
Yes, I can. Yeah, absolutely fine. We've got a couple of questions in the questions tab, apparently. If you have a little look at that bottom right-hand corner.
Oh, yeah.
One from Mark, one from Simon.
Oh, that's what I can't open. That's what's coming. Can you read them, Adrian?
Yeah, okay. So Mark Reynolds is saying, I've seen that some telematics data providers are now layering weather and risk hotspot data on top of driver behaviour scores. What are your thoughts on the value of the value this adds?
I mean, I think that's a really, really useful tool because although you can't actually do anything about weather's weather, it does enable companies to start looking at sort of hotspots where they have an incident and if they are during whatever kind of inclement weather, because low sun can be as dangerous as anything else. It doesn't have to necessarily be heavy rain or snow. What you can do then is put some sort of education program in with the drivers. So I think it's very, very useful information, and I think it does make a difference to how people drive. Even myself, I tend to drive a lot slower, but I think it can alter reaction times very much so when it's particularly icy.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's a great thing to do as well because very often when we look at speed, if we talk about speeding, people automatically think over the speed limit.
Yeah.
But very often we'll talk about appropriate speed, and
Yeah.
what might be appropriate on a bright summer's day is certainly not when the weather is inclement. So yeah, I think putting weather patterns on there is very good, but also risk hotspots as well. I
Yeah.
mean, no road is ever dangerous by default, is it? It's
No.
us that make it dangerous, but there are hotspots where we all get it wrong. So I think for people to be highlighted to these areas, it could be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think appropriate speed's such an important term, Adrian, because most country roads are a 60-mile-an-hour speed limit. But if you're on a almost single track country road that's twisting and turning for miles and miles on end, it's not safe to do 60 miles an hour on, is it? So it's not just about speed limits or whether it's about being able to make that assessment in your own head as to what's safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a question from Simon, and both you and I, Alison, are going to be chomping at the bit to answer this one. Are fleet managers aware of their risks under corporate manslaughter rules, given the nature of fleet accident risk? Do you want to do that one first?
So I think in terms of corporate manslaughter, I think it's there, but I think in terms of driving, it's almost become a bit of a toothless beast because I was HCQ is my history, so I was health and safety generally for years and years. And when corporate manslaughter was coming in, we all knew it was going to be people would be going to jails, directors were going to be held responsible, and all this was happening. Then nothing really happened, if we're honest. Very, very few cases have ever been prosecuted. I know some have, but very few have. And in terms of driving, I think maybe corporate manslaughter it's sort of held up as being something like a stick to beat people with, but actually there are so many bits of legislation that already exist before corporate manslaughter came in, particularly under health and safety legislation that covered all these sort of activities anyway. So I think it can be a bit of a red herring because it's certainly not the most likely bit of legislation to be used.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a potential worst case scenario where we have fatalities involved.
Yeah.
And when a business is thinking, should I or shouldn't I do this, i.e., manage driver safety, and they think, well, what's the chance of me getting charged with corporate manslaughter? Pretty slim. Then they might be leaning towards, well, let's just leave things as they were.
Yeah.
I think what we need to be thinking about is that managing driver safety is a legal requirement. It's the right thing to do as a responsible employer, and you should see some tangible benefits if we do it right. I like to try and encourage people thinking about it in that way, rather than say, well, you should be fearful of corporate manslaughter. And oh, by the way, if the lesser offence of failing to meet your duty of care under the Health and Safety at Work Act potentially means a fine of starting at 20% of your turnover, you've got that in a bank account, haven't you? So I think there's a mixed sort of knowledge bank here of, yes, we understand about corporate manslaughter, but I think there's more probably naive ignorance around what good driver risk management should look like per se.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I think, don't get fooled by the fact that corporate manslaughter has not been used very often because it's still there in the arsenal. But like I say, so for those of you who don't know, I'm a magistrate as well. And the amount of traffic courts we have are absolutely unbelievable. Some of those individuals, but also quite a few corporate ones. So there is a lot of legislation out there, particularly around vehicle condition as well. So, that's something that I think is a huge part of driver risk management and something that, as an insurer, you can definitely talk to your customers about, or potential customers about, actually, let's have a look at the conditions of your vehicles, because that can, in some ways, that can determine what kind of fleet that's going to be in terms of risk. It's usually quite a good indicator, Adrian, I think, isn't it?
It certainly is. I mean, I think it's the culture of the organisation comes out sometimes when you just simply just look at the condition of the vehicles, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
How are we doing for time, Alison? Because Mark has asked another question. Or
oh yeah, that's fine. I've got Mike's frozen on my screen, so could you ask that? We'll do this to be the last one, unfortunately, because we're on a 3-minute countdown.
Right, okie dokie. So Mark is saying, if you were pushed to offer a recommendation on which of the risk management techniques discussed offers insurers the greatest benefit versus cost, which would you recommend?
I would recommend being able to bring all the telematics data that you've got on your different fleets together and normalize it so that you can actually see it. So you're comparing apples with apples, and you can actually then look at what is the risk of your portfolio. And I think that's really, really important. And then once you've identified which your riskiest fleets are, I think it's definitely talking to fleets about how they introduce a driver risk management system, and that will depend on the size of the fleet. But at the risk of sounding like, I think it was Margaret Thatcher, so I really don't want to sound like her, but education is absolutely the main thing to do with drivers, based on the data that you're getting out of the telematics system. What about you, Adrian? What do you feel?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but also I'm very much a believer of, if you're building a house, you don't put a roof on first or the sides, you build a foundation. So I would encourage the insurers to go back to the business and say, well, let's just see what foundations you have in place for managing driver safety. Because it might be that they actually don't have telematics, but they've got, let's say, a large van fleet or a company car fleet. So, do you have you done a risk assessment of your driving activities? Do you have a driver safety policy? Do you capture the basic information to know who in your business is driving? It's the basics, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, thank you everybody who's listened to this. We'll be sending out the recording to everybody. Thank you very much, Adrian. Much appreciated you being on the webinar. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We could talk for about 6 hours, couldn't we? On that, we are quite anorexic when it comes to fleet risk. So thank you, everybody, very much appreciated, and we'll catch you on our next webinar. Bye.